Hi all, welcome to a short demo on JIRA project management tool, or in general people call it as JIRA. Before going to the actual demo related to the JIRA project management or project tracking or project progress tracking related tool, I just want to give you some heads up related to the agile methodology, typically making use of Scrum process. Traditionally, the waterfall model works like the business analysts will take up the requirements from the customers. They will document everything in terms of software requirement specifications or functional specifications. They hand it over to the designing team. They will come up with certain designs or mock-ups. They will further hand it over to the developers who will look into those designs for UI, look into the architectural documents given by the architect to decide the system architecture, and then they will start to develop their system. Once they are done with their development and unit testing, they will give it a handover in terms of code which gets built into a particular environment like dev or QA environment, and then they give it as a handover to the QA team to test it out. QA team will perform the system testing, integration testing, and all other aspects of testing. Whether it is manual or automation is altogether a different matter of discussion, but then they need to make sure that whatever the expected outcome of a particular requirement is getting addressed through whatever the code which has been developed according to the UI, middleware, and backend logic which the developers have developed so far. Once the QA thinks that the things are working smooth according to the expectations, they say that we are done, the things are working smooth, and now the code can be moved into the production. This is how a typical waterfall model related project management or project development process works on. And it has no way to go back. If a certain changes come in between, the model is not responsible to adapt it. Nowadays, the waterfall model is not much popular, and the reason behind that is it's not being agile. And also, one more important aspect is that the customer who is supposed to get the software developed after a certain amount of time period, customer is not at all able to get the things in between, and the customer will be able to see the complete software which gets developed after a certain amount of time period. And that's why after 6 months or after 1 year, once the software development team gives the software or delivers the software to the customer, and if the customer's expectation is something else and the customer is getting something else, in that case the customer gets frustrated, and there is no way to go back because the time period has been already elapsed. And then it becomes a problem not only for the customer but for the development team or an organization who is developing that software on behalf of a customer. So as to avoid that, nowadays agile and typically a scrum methodology in agile software development or software project management principle technologies, the agile is becoming more popular. The main advantage of agile is you don't freeze the requirements for a time period. You get the requirements from the customers, so business analysts will get the requirements from customers. They will park those enhancements in terms of high level features in epics or features. They further break it into the number of smaller enhancements or smaller functionalities, which they call it as user stories. So initially they come up with a particular release which they are targeting to do it as in terms of software delivery to a customer, and then they come up with the release, and then they create the release backlog which will internally have all those epics and user stories created, which gives an overall idea to the whole software development team including developers, architects, database people, and QAs and everyone, that what this particular release has to be worked upon, what are the things which we will need to work upon. Out of that particular release, they create the product backlog which contains the prioritized product features desired by the client. So client decides that which particular product has the highest priority. They put it into the product backlog, and then the backlog gets refined after a certain period of time. Out of this backlog, whatever the highest priority related features which we need to or a development team needs to work upon, they will be shipped into a sprint backlog. Sprint is done for ideally 2 weeks. There might be few software development teams who can work on a particular sprint for 1 week or more than 2 weeks. It depends upon the priority, severity, as well as the scope of a particular product feature which needs to be delivered at the end of sprint. So sprint is nothing but a work timeline delivery timeline which the development team has to work upon, and inside the sprint there will be few features which will be assigned to the sprint, and there will be a separate sprint backlog which will contain the list of product features which are taken out of a product backlog and then parked into a sprint backlog. The backlog gets defined. It's the responsibility of product owner as well as scrum masters according to the agile methodology to decide the sprint backlog, to explain the sprint backlog to the agile scrum team. Then there will be a 30 days of uh, a particular sprint, or 15 days or 3 weeks of sprints will run, in which there will be a continuous follow-up which will be taken on a 24 hours daily basis. There will be a daily scrum meeting which will happen where the team needs to give a status upon which particular user story or which particular subtask which an individual is working upon. And then after 30 days or 2 weeks of a sprint, a new functionality gets delivered to the customer in terms of some demo. It's not mandatory that we have to release it in terms of production environment to the customer, but then at least in dev or QA environments, the development team or QA team can give a short demo to the customer or to the product owner to make sure that what was the thing which was defined in terms of sprint backlog or individual user stories into a sprint backlog. The development team or the QA team has worked upon that particular workload backlog, and then they have delivered something. And if the product owner is saying that I expected X but you delivered Y, then they can fill in those gaps. If they think that there are certain enhancements which the product owner is saying which they need to work upon, they can adapt that change quickly. They can further create those user stories and put them as a part of next sprint. And in an active sprint, which is the current sprint, they can track everything in terms of what is the status of each individual user story which is assigned to an epic, what is the progress, which are the subtasks inside a particular user story which is being worked upon by whom, and then what is the time which an individual has spent on a particular subtask or a task or a user story. And they can track it everything. The QA team can also test it out, the functionalities which are delivered by the development team. They can also raise the bugs or enhancements which they think that this is what we expected but this is how it is currently behaving. So they can raise the bugs, they can link those bugs to the user stories, and then the development team can work upon. And at the end of the sprint, they need to make sure that each and every task inside a particular user story defined task has been worked upon by each and individual team member, and then the desired result which has been defined in terms of acceptance criteria for a particular user story has been met or not. If it is met, the user story gets closed. Similarly, all the user stories inside a particular sprint backlog gets closed. At the end of the sprint, some thing which gets developed can be showed to the product owner, or directly from the customer stakeholders point of view we can have a demo. So the demo happens, and then this goes on unless and until the whole product backlog finishes off. This is overall scrum process, and so as to facilitate this scrum process, Atlassian is one company who has given a tool which they have named it as JIRA. So JIRA is a product or a web-based application which is given by Atlassian organization, and this is a very good tool, or very ease of it provides ease of use. It is an user friendly, user interactive, as well as having n number of features which you can use to track everything which I have mentioned it as a part of scrum process. So I have basically created one user account for AISMSMS College of Engineering, and let me log into that account. And this is the web application which you are able to see it, the login screen for the JIRA utility or JIRA tool for project management, typically the agile project management. This is the system dashboard where it shows a welcome message to the JIRA tool. If a user who is making use of this JIRA software for the first time, then if you are not that much familiar with this tool, you can go to the JIRA 101 guide or Atlassian training course, from where you can get yourself familiar to this tool. Now coming back to the Scrum process, I have created one particular project in this tool named as software engineering project. If I go to this particular project, you will be able to see what are the issues which are being worked upon or which are currently created as a part of this particular project. I have created a release for our tool which is named as release 1.0.0. So if I go to this particular release, you will be able to see that these many subtasks, user stories and epics have been created for this particular release. A release gets created and then we need to create the project inside a particular release. A project can have a key associated with the project name, type as a software, and the owner, which is nothing but the current user which I have created it, which is a default owner of this particular project. Inside a project, you will be able to see the releases for which this project is currently mapped. So releases is nothing but this is the release with the start date as 1st of November and release date as 30th of November. So this is nothing but a release which we have targeted to work on, and then inside this release we need to come up with the epics, user stories and the subtasks or tasks which will be being worked upon by individual team member. So if I go to the backlog, similar to this diagram, we should have a product backlog defined. So I already have a backlog defined where I have one user story, and I have an active sprint which I have created it as SE sprint 1, which has 2 user stories mapped to it. So I do have 3 user stories which are currently created. One of them resides into the backlog item and 2 of them are currently into a sprint. So let's suppose we have 3 user stories as a part of product backlog, out of which 2 are there into the sprint, and I want to take the next one also, so I can simply take it from here and then add it into this particular sprint. Like this, it asks me to move this issue from backlog to sprint 1. I can get a confirmation and then this gets successfully moved from backlog to sprint. If you create an issue, you can create it from here. You can create a new user story from here and you can define the details into that particular user story. If I go to the active sprints, it will show you the number of user stories or the subtasks inside the user stories which are having a status of to do, in progress and done. If I go to a particular user story, for example this SE1 user story, then it has the user story name, type as a user story. You can decide the priority. Current status is in progress. Initially it gets recorded as to do. Once you click on in progress, the status gets changed to in progress. You can assign it to a particular user. You can log your work from here. So let's suppose a developer starts to work on this particular user story. They can create the subtasks from here. By clicking on a plus sign, they can create a subtask. They can give the summary, description, and then the fixed version like the release version for which this subtasks needs to be mapped. They can assign it to the individual. Subtask gets created. So I do have 2 subtasks for the development team and 1 subtask for QA team. Each individual user needs to work on a particular subtask, and then they can open that particular subtask and they can log their work hours. So from here they can log the work. So let's suppose today I have spent 5 hours on this subtask, and in the description you can mention it like I have worked on this subtask to create few SQL scripts, and then they can log it. So the work log gets logged and the work log comments will be also get stored here. And then once they think that I'm done with this subtask, they can simply close on click on this done button to close that particular subtask, and then the status gets reflected on a particular user story for that particular subtask. The user will be able to see that the subtask is done. The user story gets defined by the product owner and scrum master in terms of the description of the user story and acceptance criteria of the user story, where they need to define that this is something which is expected out of that user story, and so as to achieve that thing they need to create the subtask and they need to track it in terms of their effort as well as progress for the subtask. Once all the subtasks are done, they need to close that user story and they need to mark it as done. So as I did the subtask closure, now the subtask got moved from here to here. So whatever the subtasks which are having a status as to do, whatever the user stories which are having status as to do, they will be listed in this section. In progress subtasks and user story will be listed into this section, and completed will be listed into this done section. This active sprints dashboard gives you an overall idea about what is the current status of a particular sprint, what is the start date and end date, projected end date of a sprint, and how many days are remaining, so that one can work on their individual issues, whether it is an user story or subtask, quickly and act upon those things. Now coming back to the backlog, here you will be able to see an epic which I have created. So epic is nothing but the high level feature or functionality which needs to be recorded into JIRA, and then you need to create the individual user stories which you need to map it to the epic, and then you need to create the individual subtasks which you need to map it to the user story. So this is how it works. Once we start with the sprint out of a particular backlog, the sprint gets started, and then all the user stories will be worked upon with respect to their severity, priority, and then the team members, they need to work upon each individual user story. They need to create the subtask. Once all subtasks are done, they need to close the subtasks and close the user story. A demo needs to be happened at the end of a particular sprint to the management or to the customer, or from the customer stakeholder point of view. That demo will happen, and again in between there will be a daily scrum meeting where they need to provide the status from the JIRA tool, from where they can mention the user story. This was the user story on which I worked upon, and then this is the work which is remaining for which I will be working next, and then if something is getting acted as an impediment or obstacle, then this is how I need some help from other team members or someone who can resolve this problem. And then once it is done, then the user story needs to be closed, sprint needs to be closed, further release backlog items need to be pushed or created into the backlog. You need to create a new sprint, you need to close the previous sprint. Again those items need to be parked from backlog into the sprint. Again the new sprint starts, user stories, subtasks will be worked upon by the team members, and then this is how it progresses unless and until all the product backlog items are finished. As a part of user stories and subtasks, one can link a particular subtask to a particular user story. You can link a user story to a particular epic if there is a bug or an enhancement. So you can also create a bug or an enhancement, and you can link that particular bug or enhancement to a particular subtask or to a particular user story. And you can also attach your documents, you can link them, you can clone them, you can put some labels, you can create few components. So for example, if you have certain components which are UI components, you can link those components to a particular user story, and then here it gets displayed where you will be able to see that component as UI. So once you sort it to search for all the user stories which are having a component as UI, this is how you can sort it using the advanced search option. There are certain sections which they call it as reports, from where you can export the reports in terms of burn down charts and sprint reports, velocity charts. So currently we are into active sprint 1. and once we progress with this particular sprint, then the burn down chart will appear over here, and then you will be able to see the progress for your sprint. There are a number of other reports which are really helpful for project management. um, Coming back to the uh, dashboard, if you click on the JIRA home link, the dashboard shows you the introduction. It shows you one widget which you can alter it based upon your needs. It shows you all the issues which are currently assigned to a user who has currently logged in, and then activity stream gives you an overall idea about what are the current issues which are being worked upon by whom. And you can see, like 5 minutes ago, I have changed the status for this particular subtask from in progress to done. So it gives you an audit log of all the user activities, from where you can see who has done change for which particular subtask. And this is how the JIRA works. There are few customized settings which JIRA provides you to do, and basically the intent to use this particular tool is to track your project tracking in terms of the project progress, so as to create the releases, so as to create the epics which will contain high level functionalities. Epics will be further broken into the individual user stories. User stories will be worked upon by the Scrum team, by developers and QAs and other users. They will create their subtasks, they will track the progress through those subtasks. Once the subtasks are done, user stories can be closed within a particular sprint. It's the responsibility of Scrum Master and Product Owner to create the sprints, to check the status, the time tracking, and everything out of that particular sprint. Once the sprint is done, they need to look into the number of user stories which are completed. Those which are not completed, they need to move it to the next sprint or back to the backlog because of some dependencies which cannot be resolved at this point of time. And then the sprints will move on and move on and move on unless and until the product backlog gets wiped off. So this is how the JIRA software or a JIRA web application works, which is an Atlassian product. It is a really nice product which provides a number of features for agile project management or project tracking, project progress tracking reason, or there are other n number of features which are available for JIRA, which you can get it once you get a license from JIRA. This is just a trial version with which I have created this demo. If you really want to explore it with the more features which JIRA which delivers to their customer, you need to buy out a license from JIRA, and there is a costing which is defined for the JIRA tool. But basic intent to make use of this tool is to track everything with a single set of dashboard or single set of reports, from where you can track everything very easily. And it is really a nice feature. It is one of the top most useful or being used product in the software industry, and it is a really nice tool to do the agile project management, typically Scrum methodology, uh, pattern, wherever it is getting used in most of the software development projects. This is pretty much about JIRA tool. You can explore about this tool. You can also get it familiar by making use of a trial version. You can create your accounts, create the other user accounts. You can configure your releases, projects, and start work on it. Unless and until you do some hands-on, you will not get familiar. So I hope you will do some R&D here and there about this tool, and do some more hands-on for this particular tool. Thanks for listening. Bye.